Well, welcome everybody to season 2 of At the Intersection with Doug Newton. You know, it's a global pandemic, and I'm not talking about COVID. I'm talking about disinformation, the intentional twisting, filtering, or blocking of information to control public opinion. And you know, we're all infected. I mean, you can't take our temperature to check, but you can see it in our temperament. I mean, everybody seems hot these days, and too many people have lost their taste for truth and the ability to smell a lie. Everyone knows it's a problem and wants to do something about it. Some advocate social media distancing and isolation, but that won't work. The average person spends nearly 3 hours a day on social media, and telling somebody to stop doing that is like telling a sweetaholic to stop devouring chocolate chip cookies. I know a lot about chocolate chip cookies, and let me tell you, that doesn't work. Well, some very powerful government and corporate people have already been deciding who gets to hear what in order to protect people from disinformation. But in many cases, their biased censorship efforts have themselves contributed to disinformation. So the day has already come when the average person doesn't know who to trust and what to believe anymore. Is it too late to end this pandemic, or must we all just isolate ourselves in our preferred biases? Well, I believe there is something we all can do to end this pandemic, but it will take some time and a lot of good character. So would you take just a few minutes today to listen to my twofold proposal on how to disarm disinformation? Hi, I'm Doug Newton, pastor for 45 years, an award-winning magazine editor. That intro, didn't I? I'm going to give one insight from the Bible that speaks to that issue, and I'm going to suggest one way to strengthen the character that you and I need to relate to our mixed-up world with exemplary grace and fresh impact. Now, as I've said many times, this is a no-gripe zone. We're not here to question what's wrong with our culture. It's about what's the right way to respond. So you ready? Before we get rolling, just want to say welcome to all of you who are returning viewers of this podcast, and those of you who may be new. This is season number 2, and it's just been such a wonderful blessing to have so many people continuing to find this podcast and begin to watch or listen regularly. So I'm very grateful for all of you. So, disinformation is our topic, and it really is a problem. And part of the problem is that none of us is more than half as concerned as we need to be. Why? Because the disinformation that affirms our opinion doesn't bother us. It doesn't even register in our minds. It's only the disinformation coming from the other side that lights our fuse. So we're only half motivated to deal with the problem. We only half care. You know, both sides of various issues once assumed that the real threat, the real disinformation threat came from some vigilante sources, independent crackpots who could use a cell phone camera, and they could write anything that they wanted without journalistic training or integrity. They could make their own fake news website and just spread the disinformation virus. But that's, that kind of, passing it off as a vigilante problem is no longer the case. We now know that major news organizations and media outlets, as well as special interest groups, manipulate and block important information to control public opinion. I mean, why do they do that? How do they justify it? Well, they use the old the ends justify the means argument. You know, that's actually the spirit of fascism. In any form, within any institution, government, education, business, during any era, within any society, there are the elites who assume they know what's best, and they've got to save the proletariat, the uneducated working class, from their own ignorance. And so they attempt to control what the proletariat can hear and see and learn and how they think. You know, many years ago, one of the leading voices in the anti-abortion movement was caught on tape telling his people to fudge the numbers, to sharply exaggerate the numbers of people attending that year's National Right to Life rally in Washington, D.C., to make the crowd seem larger than it was. Why? Because the size of any crowd, of any protesting or campaigning group, influences public opinion. You know, we look and go, wow, look at the thousands of people there. It's kind of the bandwagon effect is what they're hoping for. And so he was caught manipulating the facts, you know. Well, the ends justify the means. Major media outlets frequently use sound bites and video clips that leave important context out of their story. There was a clip of Donald Trump speaking after the tragic death of a young woman during a KKK rally in Virginia that turned violent a while back. And one outlet shortened the context down to where he said, and many of these are fine people. And they made it sound like he was talking about the KKK. Partial information. But the ends justify the means. Did you know that more recently, just after the deadly fires at Lahaina, Maui, remember? One news source reported using video evidence that families were being forcibly removed from their land by the police. And that video-supported report went viral, sparking fires of outrage around the world that spread much farther than the physical flames themselves. However, the Associated Press fact-checking service soon reported that the video was from a 1985 incident with police evicting some people from a beach park on the island of Oahu. But the video had already spread, done its damage, and can't be erased from the minds of people who will never know about the exposed disinformation. The ends justify the means. I've probably dwelt long enough on the problem. You didn't actually need any proof that disinformation is there, do you? So, what's the solution? How do we disarm disinformation? Well, I've got two strategies to present this today. One is long-term, something that's going to take a couple generations or more to bring about change, but it will be a more lasting change. The second solution is an immediate but only partial disarmament, and yet it's still absolutely necessary no matter what. The long-term solution, let's talk about that. It's always been around, and in some pockets in the United States, but it is flying under the radar. And that's this. It's kind of a movement to return to a more classical form of education. Now, I doubt that that's going to happen in public education sector very soon, if at all. But it is happening in some private schools and among many homeschoolers. What is classical education? Classical education is basically an education around two kind of categories of learning, the trivium and the quadrivium. Now, I can't go into detail here. Just Google trivium or quadrivium, and you're going to land on all sorts of information where you can learn about it, and it would be worth doing. Just Google classical education or trivium, for example. Basically, it's an approach to education where children, elementary school-aged children, are first taught to think well before they are taught subject matter, like arithmetic or music or geometry or astronomy. The trivium concentrates on teaching grammar first, and then reasoning, and then rhetoric. In other words, you first learn how words and sentences work together to produce meaning. Then you learn how good thinking works. Then you learn how good communication works. That's grammar, reasoning, and rhetoric. Now, I bet you're surprised, because I think we've all been conditioned to think that young elementary age kids' brains, they're just not developed enough at that age to do those trivium kind of things. Not so. This is the way education was done up until just the last few generations. In 1947, Dorothy Sayers, a detective novelist from England, a prolific and very famous one, who was also a teacher at times, but she was in the circle with C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. She challenged educators to return to classical modes of education. Her Oxford presentation that she gave sounds remarkably current today. Let me read a paraphrase of her opening paragraphs. She says, has it ever struck you as odd or unfortunate that even though literacy is at the highest levels in history, people are more susceptible to the influence of advertisement and mass media? Is this just because the media is so much more pervasive? This was 1947, nearly 80 years ago. She's asking this question already, way back then. Here she went on, she said, have you ever listened to people debate an issue and become disturbed over their extraordinary inability to speak to the issue or understand the arguments of the other side? Or, she went on, how often people insert irrelevant matter into their argument. This was 1947 and this was going on. Here, and she went on. Have you ever noticed how often people use terms they don't define? And no one seems to notice that disagreements arise because people have different meanings for a key word they use. And like if we were to take her words and apply them today, we'd be thinking about things like justice or equity. Equity. We need to define our terms first before we all start arguing. But she was pointing that out. 1947. I mean, to boil it all down into one sentence, Sayers is saying, people these days don't think well. Don't think well. And she was advocating, let's bring back into education those very fundamentals before kids even get started learning lots of information and history and everything. Let's bring back in helping them learn to understand the use of language and think and to communicate well. So in 1947, she was already trumpeting her concerns, and over the last 75 years, things have only gotten worse, making all of us average folks easy targets for disinformation. But it would take, a tsunami-sized change in public education to shift its approach toward a more classical education mode. I think that ship sailed. I mean, it's hard to imagine that could happen. But even if it happened, it would still take 2, 3, 4 generations to produce a real change in culture, a lasting change. Do we have that much time? Probably not. It takes a lot of work to learn to think well. Do you know scientists tell us that the average person makes 35,000 decisions a day. Now, we're not conscious of most of them. They slip by, happen very fast, because they point out, and they've studied the brain is wired to summarize all this input coming in, summarize it in chunks, almost like having sort of a one symbol X that represents a whole set of experiences, and our brains can compute the X and not all of those words coming in. In other words, the brain is wired to take the quickest way toward arriving at a conclusion. The very function of our brains pushes us in the direction of jumping to conclusions. And restraining and redirecting impulsive thinking is hard work, because it requires great effort to pay that much attention to what we are thinking as we're thinking it and what we're saying as we're saying it. But that then leads me to my second solution for disarming disinformation. It is the quicker one. It's the one you can actually start today. As I said, it's only a partial solution, but it will help significantly. And it's based on the old principle, it takes two to tango. or the old principle that says, you know how to stop a fight? Don't throw a return punch. If you follow that principle, you will cut the disinformation problem as it pertains to your life and influence in half, right? And so we each can make two general commitments this very day. Keep from believing disinformation and keep from speaking disinformation. But now you say, Doug, what you're saying kind of bothers me, because are you saying that I speak disinformation? Are you calling me a liar? Because you said at the beginning of the podcast that disinformation is, and I quote, this is what you said, the intentional twisting, filtering, or blocking of information to control public opinion. Now, I admit I sometimes may pass on something that's not 100% accurate, that influences other people's opinions, but I don't do it intentionally. Well, hear me now. I mean, I'm not trying to accuse you, but I want to talk to all of us about what honesty is and what our moral responsibility is whenever we are stating a supposed fact or making a claim about something being true. To say that you didn't know something was incorrect when you said it doesn't absolve you of the responsibility to know in advance whether something is accurate before you say it. And if you knowingly pass something on before you've tested its accuracy, then it was, in effect, an intentional act on your part, and you're wanting the other person to accept what you're saying without having checked it out. You know, the Bible states this: anyone then who knows the good he ought to do and doesn't do it sins, James 4:17. Now, let me go back here. That is actually a moral standard, right, shared in culture, Judeo-Christian culture. But do you realize that's a moral standard that is shared in cultures beyond the Judeo-Christian culture? I mean, you know, if the word sin bothers you, for me to be saying, you know, if you pass on information you haven't checked out, that's sin, then let's just call it wrong. In other words, to know what's right, to know what's good, to know what's best, to be able to do it and not do it is wrong. Now, many of you know that I have a character trait development program where I have modules where each one focuses on one of 12 different target character traits, you know, where these 12 traits are what I consider to be kind of fundamental building blocks for good character. The one we need to pay more attention to is the trait of honesty, And this is the little exercise book that I wrote about that. And these exercises are based on a definition that I've developed for honesty, which admittedly is a very high standard for honesty. And yet, is it ever right to lower the honesty standard? I mean, is it ever right to say, well, I know what the honesty is here, but let's not shoot for that? I mean, how can you do that and be an honest person? So, I mean, honesty is honesty, right? So here's my definition. I called these definitions that I give for these traits blue jean definitions because they're more practical, life-oriented than academic sounding, but here it is. Honesty is conscientiously preventing others from believing what you know is untrue. Conscientiously preventing others from believing what you know is untrue. You see, honesty is bigger than most people think. It's not just a matter of not telling lies, whether big lies or little lies. Of course, you do have to make sure that nothing untrue comes out of your mouth. That's part of honesty. But do you realize that most deception occurs not because of what you say, but what you don't say, to make sure people know the truth? Like, for example, if a teenager crashes his parents' car, and he comes home and he tells them, I wasn't goofing around with my friends at all, as a way of claiming he wasn't doing anything irresponsible, but he doesn't happen to mention that he was texting on his phone at the time. He's leading them to believe something that isn't true, even though nothing that came out of his mouth was false, right? But he was leading them to believe that the accident wasn't his fault. This is why the classic oath that a witness has to give in court to tell the whole truth, the whole truth, right? And nothing but the truth, the whole truth. That's what that's about. When you leave out an important fact, you are leaving people to believe something that is not true. This is why people find it difficult to trust news sources these days, right? We can't be sure we're hearing all the facts. They're usually choosing which facts and sound bites to feature to advance an ideological agenda. A 5-second video doesn't tell the whole story. And we know that to be a big problem among the media outlets, but, we're just as prone to share partial facts, partial information, and think we're telling the truth just because none of the things we said are false. If you lead someone to believe something untrue, even if nothing comes out of your mouth at all, you're still being dishonest. Like if someone gives you credit for doing something that you really didn't have much to do with, but you remain silent, you're leading that person to believe you're the one who deserves the credit. That's dishonesty. And you see, this requires careful attention. That's why I use the word conscientiously. That's because dishonesty will sneak up on you before you know it. And there you are, being dishonest. So, my definition begins with that word conscientiously, preventing others from believing what you know is true. You have to bring this same vigilance, watchfulness into your sharing of information and opinion. You have to be careful to watch every word coming out of your mouth, even if you're repeating what you heard from some other source that you believe to be telling the truth. There's a quote from the Bible. I love it. It's about the great high priest of Israel named Samuel when he was young and then growing up, which I think if we would get hold of what this is saying, it would do the most in our hearts to propel us toward this passionate pursuit of honesty. And it goes this way. It's 1 Samuel 3:19. The Lord was with Samuel as he grew up, and he let none of his words fall to the ground. Now, it's hard to know for sure who the pronouns are referring to in this statement. It could be saying the Lord was with Samuel as Samuel grew up. That's obvious. And he, the Lord, let none of Samuel's words fall to the ground. Or the Lord was with Samuel as Samuel grew up, and the Lord let none of the Lord's words fall to the ground. In other words, the Lord always watched his words and made sure that they came true. Or it could mean the Lord was with Samuel as he grew up, and he, Samuel, let none of Samuel's words fall to the ground. That he was very careful to make sure that his words did not fall flat. Now, I don't know which way we should read it, but I actually think it's the vagueness in this case, the ambiguity, I should say, in this case, it's actually conducive to good reflection. And it really comes down to this bottom line. Whether that's about the Lord or the Samuel and Samuel's words falling to the Lord's words falling to the ground, the point is we are supposed to be very careful that when we say something or the thoughts behind it, those words need to be able to stand up and not fall to the ground empty, cracked, meaningless. You see, if you and I could embrace that passion, that all-out determination to always speak reliable words, trustworthy words, that would go a long way towards spurring us on to have no part in spreading disinformation. And at least one half of the problem in our small corner of the world might be solved. I'm starting out, as I said, season 2 of my podcast, and I am still committed to making a free practice guide that I call Crosswalk every week, available to anybody who wants it. And I'm so pleased that many individuals and even some church groups are downloading these crosswalks and using them for group discussion. Because they're very helpful in taking these kind of basic character principles that I ultimately land on and then fleshing them out in very personal ways. And I would urge you to download this one. Here it is up on the screen. Download this one quickly, before you forget. Life goes on and we forget all sorts of things. And the special slant on this crosswalk is to give you some affirmation statements. They're not really questions for you to examine your life, but they're affirmation statements for you to embrace and live by. Things like, don't share if you're not sure. A little bit of a mnemonic device. Don't share if you're not sure. Be suspicious of your choice. And I go into some, I kind of flesh each of those ideas out so you can kind of see what I'm talking about and how it applies to your life. Be suspicious of yourself. Be suspicious of yourself. What does that mean? And how do you do that? And why? Here's one. I tell you, if I could burn a statement, I'd burn this one. Put away, and I say, put away this attitude. Everyone has a right to his own opinion. Well, isn't that a fundamental American principle? Everybody has a right to his opinion. Well, we've got freedom of speech, but that doesn't mean that we have a right to say stupid things that aren't supported by facts. You see? That's like saying, well, I'll leave you to read. I explain that a little bit more. But anyways, I'd like to go on. Here's the final. Do sincere opposition research. Do sincere opposition research. Well, there you go. That's it for this week. I'm so glad that you were here. I hope you all agree that this is important stuff, right? Especially in this age of disinformation. If you appreciate what I'm trying to do in the podcast, would you share it with friends, with your friends, and subscribe to the Fresh Impact YouTube channel if you would. In 24 hours, I'll have a permanent version out on YouTube and an audio-only version for those who want to listen to this on the go. All of the information about the podcasts, past and future, can be found on our website, and all the links can be found at the end of this video. So anyways, thanks again for tuning in. If you think this podcast is worth something, I hope you'll continue to obviously tune in, but would you leave me a comment? or send me an email. Well, I hope you'll join me again next week at the intersection with Doug Newton. I'm already looking forward to addressing the incredible phenomena surrounding artificial intelligence and how, especially after something that Zoom is now making possible because of AI, how we're going to have to guard against its effects on character. Can't wait. In the meantime, remember, you are the front lines in the battle to disarm disinformation. So pursue honesty.